Little Tatterford, a village nestled within the rolling hills of the English countryside, had always been a peaceful place. The village was a tapestry of quaint cottages with thatched roofs, neat gardens, and cobbled lanes that led to the heart of the village, the church and its surrounding green. On Sundays, as the bells chimed, villagers in their Sunday best walked along these lanes, exchanging pleasantries and sharing news of the week. Today, however, a ripple had disrupted the calm that usually settled over the place like a soft blanket. It was the day of the May Day festival, and the sun shone brightly on the village square, where an air of excitement stirred. The bright ribbons of the maypole twisted in the gentle breeze, children in floral dresses ran circles around it, and the smell of freshly baked goods wafted through the air from Mrs. Pemberley's stall. The villagers were delighted, chattering about flowers, vegetables, and the upcoming festivities. At the village hall, the opening speech was about to begin. As everyone gathered, a faint murmur of laughter swept through the crowd. Mrs. Featherstone, wearing her finest purple hat, was telling a story about her roses, which had bloomed particularly well this year. Just as she reached the punchline, a loud cry shattered the peace. "What in the world is that?" The voice was shrill and full of shock, and it was followed by the swift scurrying of feet. The crowd shifted, murmurs growing louder. Everyone turned to see what had happened. At the far end of the hall, near the grand fireplace, Charles Willingham, the village solicitor, had collapsed. He was a man in his early 50s, always seen in his well-tailored suits, his hair combed meticulously, and his manner as unruffled as the law itself. But now, he was a crumpled figure, his body lifeless, and half leaning against the mantelpiece. His face, usually calm and composed, was frozen in an expression of shock, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open in what could only be described as a last gasp of surprise. A chair, perhaps tipped over in his sudden collapse, lay at his side. In his outstretched hand was a letter, its edges scorched, the paper curling, as if it had been too close to the flames of the hearth. The room fell silent for a moment, a collective breath held as they processed the sight. Willingham, the ever-dutiful village solicitor, had fallen in full view of the entire gathering, and the letter in his hand, burned at the edges, seemed like a strange message of its own. "Is he dead?" a voice from the crowd whispered. "Someone fetch Dr. Hargrove, quickly!" came another voice, more urgent. But no one moved just yet. They stood, frozen in disbelief, staring at Willingham's body and the letter that seemed to tell a story only he knew. Miss Marple, seated at the back of the hall, watched with her usual quiet demeanor. Unlike the others, she was not panicked. She had lived long enough to understand that in times like this, it was the smallest details that could unravel the truth. As the constables arrived and the crowd began to shuffle back, Miss Marple remained still, observing the scene with a calmness that bordered on the unnerving. Her mind began to piece together the puzzle. Willingham's collapse, the letter, the fire, it all suggested something far more deliberate than a simple accident. But why? What had the letter contained? Why had he been holding it when he fell? As the room bustled with questions, Miss Marple rose from her seat. She moved slowly, her presence barely noticed as she made her way toward the fireplace. The constables had already begun their cursory examination of the scene, but Miss Marple knew that there was more here than met the eye. The village reacts. Gossip spreads. As the initial shock wore off, the villagers' reactions began to show their true nature: curiosity, speculation, and the inevitable gossip that seemed to thrive in small towns. Soon, the story of Willingham's collapse spread through Little Tatterford like wildfire. Each person who heard the news added their own layer of drama to it, making it something far grander than a mere accident. "I've heard it was a stroke," Mrs. Pemberley said, fanning herself dramatically as she passed by the village square. "He did look rather pale earlier in the week, didn't he?" "Stroke, you say?" Mr. Stone, the baker, was quick to jump in. "I'll tell you what I think. It's not a stroke. I've seen men collapse before, and this looks more like poison. Something was wrong with him. Mark my words. He'd been acting oddly these past few days." "Oh, don't be so ridiculous," Mrs. Featherstone interjected, overhearing from her garden just across the street. "Everyone knows he's been a bit off lately. But I've heard it's something to do with his business. He's been arguing with that fellow, Reginald Burkhart, the one who owns the ironworks. You know, about some contract or other. You don't think, Mr. Stone lowered his voice, that it could be something to do with his wife? What about his wife? Mrs. Pemberley raised her eyebrows. He's had his eye on young Miss Stokes, the schoolteacher, hasn't he? Saw him at the crossroads last Tuesday, looking at her like he could hardly wait to speak to her. At this, Miss Marple could not help but smile to herself. The village was already wrapping the mystery in a neat little bow, filled with intrigue and scandal. She knew, of course, that the truth was rarely this tidy. She paused by the fire where the burnt edges of the letter still lay, its ink smudged in places. What could it contain? What was so important that it had been clutched in Willingham's hand at the moment of his collapse? The question nagged at her. Early investigation. Miss Marple quietly observes. By the time Inspector Brooks arrived, the scene had taken on the usual chaos of an investigation. Constables were asking questions, some with the tact of a hammer, others more cautiously. Brooks, a portly man with a heavy mustache, scanned the room with a practiced eye, his gaze lingering on the body before shifting to the letter. Miss Marple, he greeted her politely. I trust you've seen what happened? Yes, Inspector, she replied calmly, her voice carrying the authority of one who had witnessed many such scenes before. But I wonder if you've noticed what I've noticed. Brooks frowned, adjusting his glasses. What do you mean? The letter, Inspector, Miss Marple said softly, stepping closer to the hearth. The way it burned, it wasn't just carelessly thrown into the fire. It was strategically placed there. Inspector Brooks, who had seen his share of crimes in the village, took a moment to study the letter himself. It certainly doesn't look like the work of an accident. But we don't know what was in it yet, do we? Miss Marple shook her head. No, not yet, but I would be willing to wager that the contents of that letter hold the key to everything. Willingham didn't collapse from poison or illness, as some might suggest. He died from a far more subtle cause, something related to that letter. The inspector seemed skeptical. You think the letter killed him? Not directly, Miss Marple replied. But it certainly played a part. I suspect this isn't a case of an accidental death. I suspect someone was desperate to ensure that the contents of that letter never saw the light of day. Brooks scratched his chin. We'll have to see what Dr. Hargrove says, but if you're right, Miss Marple, this is no ordinary case. First suspects. The obvious suspect emerges. The villagers, as expected, had begun to settle on their first suspect, Reginald Burkhart. The local ironworks owner had been known to have a tense relationship with Willingham over a recent business dispute. Whispers began to circulate that the two had been at odds over a lucrative contract, one that would significantly impact Burkhart's bottom line. I'm telling you, Miss Marple, Mrs. Featherstone said over tea that afternoon. Reginald Burkhart had everything to gain from Willingham's sudden demise. The contract was set to be signed soon, and I've heard rumors that Willingham was going to pull out of it at the last minute, leaving Burkhart in the lurch. Miss Marple listened quietly, allowing the gossip to wash over her. She knew that. While Burkhart might have had a motive, the real story often lay beneath the surface of such obvious suspicions. A hidden clue. A minor detail. As the investigation continued, Miss Marple's attention returned to the seemingly insignificant details that others had overlooked. The letter, the fire, the half-consumed edges of the paper, the fact that Willingham had been clutching it in his final moments. It all suggested a story, but one that wasn't immediately apparent. I wonder, Inspector, Miss Marple said softly as they stood together by the fireplace, why the letter was so carefully burned. Perhaps it wasn't the first attempt to destroy it. Brooks raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? That someone tried to destroy it before, she replied, her voice low and deliberate. But perhaps they were interrupted. The village reacts. Gossip continues. As the days passed, the investigation into Charles Willingham's death continued to unfold in its typical small-town fashion, with each villager adding their own theories to the growing pile of speculation. Miss Marple, ever observant, continued to watch the proceedings with her usual quiet demeanor, carefully noting the reactions and interactions of those around her. It was clear to her that the mystery of Willingham's death was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The scene at the village hall had barely settled when the local constables began their official inquiry. They were led by Inspector Brooks, whose heavy-set frame and furrowed brow gave him the appearance of a man who was used to getting answers, though Miss Marple had often observed that he had a tendency to jump to conclusions without considering the deeper motives of the people involved. At first glance, the villagers seemed eager to cooperate with the investigation, offering their own theories and suspicions. Mrs. Pemberley, the florist, was the first to speak up, shaking her head as she discussed the events with anyone who would listen. "It was no accident, you see. He must have known something. And he was holding that letter for a reason," she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority as she handed out freshly picked roses to anyone who seemed interested in her words. "If you ask me, there's something terribly suspicious about it all." "Of course he was the solicitor," added Mr. Stone, the baker, who had a particular fondness for gossip. "It's always the quiet ones, isn't it? Who knows what secrets he was hiding? Maybe someone wanted to make sure those secrets stayed hidden forever." The whispers among the villagers grew louder as more and more theories were floated. A few suggested that the letter's contents might have revealed a long-buried scandal, something Willingham had been carefully keeping out of the public eye. Others were quick to point fingers at Reginald Burkhart, the ironworks owner, citing the recent contract dispute between him and Willingham as a motive. Miss Marple had overheard these conversations with a knowing smile. She had seen it all before. Small towns always jump to conclusions, and the more dramatic the theory, the more it was likely to stick. It wasn't just the villagers who were quick to pass judgment. Even the constables, though professionally minded, seemed to have their minds set on Burkhart. They had already visited him at the ironworks, where he was hard at work, inspecting the latest batch of metal he'd received from a supplier. "Mr. Burkhart," Inspector Brooks said, his voice firm but not unfriendly, "we'd like to ask you a few questions about your relationship with Mr. Willingham, specifically the recent contract dispute. Can you tell us about it?" Burkhart looked up from the piece of metal he was examining, wiping his hands on his apron. His broad shoulders tensed slightly, but his face remained calm, betraying none of the nervousness that some would have shown in such a situation. He was a man used to standing his ground, whether in business or in a confrontation. "There's nothing to discuss," Burkhart replied, his voice low and deliberate. "Yes, we had a disagreement. Willingham wasn't the easiest man to work with. But a disagreement over a business deal hardly constitutes murder, does it?" "I agree," Brooks said, though his tone was tinged with skepticism. "But given the timing of your dispute and the fact that Mr. Willingham had been holding onto a letter just before he collapsed, well, it does raise some questions." Burkhart's eyes flickered, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might say more. But he merely shrugged. "That letter may have been personal. I have no idea what it contained. And as for his sudden collapse, I don't see how that concerns me." The conversation ended there, with Brooks nodding curtly and making a note in his ever-present notebook. As he and the constables left the ironworks, Miss Marple watched them from across the street. She was careful to remain unnoticed, but her eyes were sharp, noting the slight tension in Burkhart's posture, the way his fingers had gripped the metal when Brooks mentioned the letter. There was something there, Miss Marple was certain of, but she also knew that appearances could be deceiving. Early investigation. Miss Marple's quiet observations. While the constables focused their efforts on Burkhart, Miss Marple decided to take a more subtle approach. She spent the following days observing the villagers as they went about their daily routines. She visited the village hall, where the scene of Willingham's collapse was still fresh in the minds of many, and she listened quietly to the hushed conversations that arose at the local pub. It was there, in the dimly lit corner of the Three Pines Inn, that Miss Marple overheard a conversation that piqued her interest. Mrs. Featherstone, who was known for her love of telling stories, was speaking to her friend Mrs. Barrington in low tones. "You know, I heard something rather strange," Mrs. Featherstone said, her voice barely audible over the clink of glasses. "It's been said that Willingham was having an affair. And not just with anyone. He was seeing someone right here." in the village. A woman who's been married for years. It's all very hush-hush, but I have it from a very reliable source." Mrs. Barrington gasped, her eyes widening. "You don't mean—" "Yes, I do," Mrs. Featherstone replied, her tone heavy with the weight of gossip. "And if you ask me, that could be the reason why someone decided to put an end to his little secret. Perhaps someone caught wind of it and decided to take matters into their own hands." Miss Marple's mind whirred as she processed the information. An affair? It was entirely plausible. Willingham had always been a man of great self-control, but behind that facade, he could have had a life no one knew about. She needed to find out more, and she needed to do so without drawing attention to herself. That evening, she paid a visit to Mrs. Denby, a local widow who had been a friend of Willingham's for many years. Mrs. Denby was well known for her sharp memory and her ability to keep secrets, though she would never openly admit it. "I'm sure you've heard the news, Mrs. Denby," Miss Marple said as she sat across from her, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "About Mr. Willingham's sudden death." "Yes, I heard," Mrs. Denby replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "Poor Charles. He was a good man, always so proper, but, well—" She paused, glancing around as if checking to ensure they were alone. "He had his shortcomings, you know. No one is perfect." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her voice low. "What do you mean by shortcomings, Mrs. Denby?" The older woman hesitated before answering, her eyes darting nervously. "There were rumors. Of course, rumors are just that. Rumors. But people whispered that Charles had a certain fondness for young women. Not that he ever acted on it, mind you, but I know he was very close to Miss Stokes, the schoolteacher. Always polite, always attentive. And then there was that letter—" "A letter?" Miss Marple asked, her heart quickening at the mention of it. "What letter?" Mrs. Denby's voice dropped to a whisper. "Oh, you know, the one he was holding when he collapsed. I don't know for sure, but I'd wager it had something to do with Miss Stokes. He was quite taken with her, you know." A hidden clue. The burnt edges. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully as Mrs. Denby continued her story, but her mind was already racing ahead. The mention of a letter, possibly written by a young woman, changed everything. She was no longer convinced that Willingham's death was simply a matter of business or social rivalry. Something more personal was at play. The letter had been deliberately burned, not out of fear of it being discovered, but to prevent its contents from being read. As Miss Marple pondered the connections between Willingham's relationships, the motive behind the murder became clearer. The village was rife with secrets, and those secrets had begun to surface, one by one. Confrontations and secrets. Unraveling the web. By the following week, the investigation had gained momentum. But Miss Marple's quiet observations told her that the villagers were still not seeing the truth. The most obvious suspects were all too convenient, too neatly tied into their roles. But Miss Marple knew that a real mystery could never be solved so easily. She continued to observe, waiting for that crucial moment when the pieces would finally fall into place. And though she had a hunch about who the murderer might be, she knew better than to rush to conclusions. There was still much left to discover: secrets, betrayals, and a web of lies that needed untangling. For Miss Marple, the game was just beginning. Another twist. A new revelation. The days in Little Tatterford continued to pass with a rhythm that felt unnaturally slow, as though time itself had stalled under the weight of the unresolved mystery surrounding Charles Willingham's death. The village, usually bustling with the comings and goings of its residents, seemed to have settled into an uneasy quiet. But Miss Marple, with her practiced eye and sharp mind, knew that nothing could be hidden for long. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the final picture remained just out of reach. In the interim, the investigation had shifted its focus. Inspector Brooks, after interviewing Reginald Burkhart and other key witnesses, had begun to look into Willingham's more personal affairs. As the constables combed through the solicitor's office, they discovered several letters and documents that hinted at a deeper layer to the case, one that had nothing to do with business dealings or local rivalries. The letters were full of references to someone named MJ, a woman whose identity was still a mystery. This new information was a turning point in the investigation, but it also sparked fresh rumors within the village. Word spread quickly that Willingham had been involved in a secret relationship, and suspicion immediately turned to Miss Stokes, the village schoolteacher. She had been a frequent visitor to Willingham's office, and her name was mentioned several times in the letters that the constables had unearthed. The villagers, ever eager to latch onto a new theory, buzzed with speculation, and once again Burkhart's name surfaced as the villain in this ongoing drama. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. She had heard the rumors surrounding Miss Stokes, but something about the entire situation didn't sit right with her. The more she observed, the more she began to realize that the key to solving this mystery lay not just in the letters or the relationships that appeared to be at the heart of the scandal, but in the subtle details, the ones others overlooked. The final pieces. Unlikely alliances. A week passed, and Miss Marple found herself increasingly immersed in the intricate web of relationships that defined the village's social structure. She made it a point to visit Mrs. Pemberley at her flower shop, where the local florist had, as always, an abundance of gossip to share. "You know, Miss Marple," Mrs. Pemberley began, wiping her hands on her apron, "I've been thinking about that poor solicitor, Mr. Willingham. I never trusted him, you know. Always too good to be true. There was something cold about him." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I'm sure there was more to Mr. Willingham than met the eye. But tell me, Mrs. Pemberley, did you happen to notice anything unusual about the day of the festival?" The question caught Mrs. Pemberley off guard, and for a moment she looked away, as if unsure whether to speak. After a long pause, she nodded, lowering her voice. "I did see something. Just before the incident, before he collapsed, I mean, Mr. Willingham had a brief conversation with Miss Stokes. It wasn't long, but I could see that she was upset. She left his office in a hurry." "Do you think they argued?" Miss Marple asked, her tone soft but probing. "I don't know," Mrs. Pemberley replied, her eyes flicking toward the door to ensure no one was listening. "But I saw her, wiping her eyes like she'd been crying. And Willingham? He seemed more agitated than I've ever seen him. It was strange. And then, right after that, he collapsed. It was as if something had just broken." Miss Marple's mind began to race. Could Miss Stokes have been involved in the solicitor's death? It seemed unlikely, given the nature of their relationship, but the idea that the woman might have been upset, possibly over something personal, was intriguing. She would have to speak with Miss Stokes herself to learn more. Confrontations and secrets. A conversation with Miss Stokes. The following afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the village school. It was a small, ivy-covered building nestled at the edge of the village, and as usual, it exuded an air of calm. Inside, the children were busy with their lessons, their laughter and chatter spilling out through the open windows. Miss Stokes, the schoolteacher, was just finishing her lesson when Miss Marple arrived. She had a kind face, though it was often clouded with a hint of sadness that Miss Marple had noticed on previous occasions. The schoolteacher's attire, as always, was modest and proper, but there was something about her presence that suggested she carried a weight, one that went unnoticed by most of the village. "Good afternoon, Miss Stokes," Miss Marple greeted her gently, stepping into the classroom with her usual calm demeanor. "Oh, Miss Marple," Miss Stokes replied, a little startled but polite nonetheless. "What brings you here?" "I was hoping we could have a little chat," Miss Marple said with a warm smile. "I've heard a few things, and I thought you might be able to shed some light on them." Miss Stokes hesitated but gestured toward the teacher's desk, where they could sit down. "I don't know what I can tell you, but I'm happy to speak with you. What is it you're concerned about?" Miss Marple took a seat, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "I understand that you and Mr. Willingham were well acquainted. He often spoke highly of you, and I must admit I was curious about the letter he was holding when he collapsed. It's been said that it was connected to you." At the mention of the letter, Miss Stokes's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but then closed it again, her hands trembling slightly. "Please, Miss Stokes, there's no need to be afraid," Miss Marple said gently. "Whatever it is, I'm here to listen. You see, I believe there's more to this than meets the eye, and I think you may know something that could help." The schoolteacher took a deep breath, her hands folding in her lap as she finally spoke. Yes, I knew Mr. Willingham, and we did have a conversation before it happened, but it wasn't what people think. It wasn't an argument. It was about something else entirely. Miss Marple's interest piqued. Something else? What do you mean? Miss Stokes hesitated again, her gaze dropping to the floor. Mr. Willingham was trying to help me. He'd recently come across some information, something that could ruin me. He promised he would keep it quiet, but I was terrified. I begged him not to reveal it. I didn't know what else to do. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but urgent. What was it? What information did he have? The schoolteacher's voice trembled. I was involved in a terrible mistake. Something from my past, something that, if it were known, could destroy everything. Mr. Willingham was going to keep it to himself, but I'm afraid I never told him everything. I never told him about the letter. The letter? Miss Marple echoed. Yes, Miss Stokes whispered, her face pale. It was a letter from someone who had been blackmailing me, and Willingham. He found out about it. I didn't know how to stop it. Miss Marple sat back, her mind processing this new information. Miss Stokes had been hiding something from her past, something that, if exposed, could ruin her reputation and future. But who had been blackmailing her, and why? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a clearer picture, but there was still a missing element. Miss Stokes's involvement, her fear of exposure, and the letter that had been burned, everything pointed to a deeper, more complex motive. Miss Marple stood, a thoughtful expression on her face. Thank you, Miss Stokes. I believe you've just given me an important clue. Now we must find out who was really behind the blackmail. The reveal. The hidden hand. As Miss Marple left the schoolhouse, she felt a shift in the air. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but there was still much to uncover. Miss Stokes's revelation about the blackmail added a new layer to the case, but it also raised more questions than it answered. Who had sent the letter? What had Willingham really known? And why had he been holding on to that letter when he died? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted as she passed the village green, where several of the villagers had gathered. She paused, watching them from a distance, knowing that the answers to all these questions would soon come to light. It was only a matter of time before the final piece of the puzzle was revealed. It had been a few days since Miss Marple's conversation with Miss Stokes, and the threads of the mystery had begun to intertwine in ways that only a mind as keen as hers could detect. The quiet village of Little Tatterford, always so peaceful, on the surface had become a hotbed of secrets, hidden motives, and unspoken fears. Willingham's death had cast a shadow over the place, and the more Miss Marple thought about it, the more she became convinced that the truth lay not in the obvious, the blackmail, the affair, or the business dispute, but somewhere deeper, beneath the carefully maintained facades of respectability. The investigation had revealed much, but it had also obscured the central question: who really stood to gain from Willingham's death? Miss Stokes's confession had been an important step forward, but there was still a lingering doubt in Miss Marple's mind. She couldn't help but wonder whether the schoolteacher was truly the key to the mystery, or if she was just another piece in a much larger puzzle. There was something in her demeanor, a slight nervousness, a trembling in her hands, that suggested she was hiding more than she had let on. Was she the victim of a malicious scheme, or had she played a larger role than she was willing to admit? With each passing day, the tension in the village grew. The constant flow of gossip had not slowed. Mrs. Featherstone, as always, was full of theories. Mark my words, she told anyone who would listen, the blackmail was the last straw. The poor girl was desperate, but someone else must have known about it, someone who could have used that knowledge against her. Miss Marple smiled to herself as she overheard the conversation from a distance. Mrs. Featherstone's dramatic flair was ever so predictable, yet it wasn't without its value. She had a knack for drawing attention to what others might overlook. But Miss Marple was not swayed by the rumors. She trusted her own observations, her understanding of human nature, and the quiet patterns she had seen unfold over the past week. She had already decided that it was time to confront the one person who she suspected had been hiding in plain sight, Reginald Burkhart. Though he had initially been an obvious suspect, Miss Marple's careful scrutiny of his actions had revealed something else. Burkhart was not as straightforward as he appeared. There was a subtle hesitation in his movements, a flicker of discomfort whenever Willingham's name came up in conversation. But what exactly was he hiding? The final piece. Reginald Burkhart. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple arrived at Burkhart's ironworks. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the industrial buildings and the stacks of metal piled high along the perimeter. Reginald Burkhart was out front, inspecting a new shipment of steel. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, a rough exterior, and the unmistakable air of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. His eyes, however, betrayed something more. Something not easily seen by the casual observer. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a polite nod, his voice a deep rumble. "What brings you here today?" "I thought we might have a chat, Mr. Burkhart," she said calmly, her voice betraying none of the sharpness in her mind. "About Mr. Willingham, of course." Burkhart's posture stiffened, but he quickly masked it with a forced smile. "I'm afraid I've already spoken to the constables. What else is there to discuss?" "Oh, I don't believe I need to trouble you with questions the police have already asked," Miss Marple said, her gaze lingering on him. "I'm more interested in something else, something I think you might know. You see, I've been observing things, and I've come to a rather interesting conclusion." Burkhart raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "And what conclusion might that be?" "I think you knew about the letter," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. "The letter that Mr. Willingham was holding when he died. The letter that was burned." Burkhart's expression remained neutral, but the faintest tightening of his jaw was enough to confirm Miss Marple's suspicion. He was hiding something far more important than he had let on. "The letter?" he asked, his voice casual. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I think you do, Mr. Burkhart, and I think you were the one who gave it to him." Burkhart's eyes flickered, a brief flash of panic passing through them before he regained his composure. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable under Miss Marple's scrutiny. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his tone now a bit more strained. "I had no reason to give Willingham anything." Miss Marple smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "You had every reason, Mr. Burkhart. You were being blackmailed, weren't you?" The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Burkhart's composure cracked. His eyes darted around as if searching for a way out, but there was no escaping the truth now. Miss Marple had hit the mark. The slight movement in his eyes, the clenching of his fists, everything told her that she had finally uncovered the truth. Burkhart began, but he stopped himself, realizing there was no use in lying anymore. Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice calm but firm. "It's not too late, Mr. Burkhart. You can still tell me the whole story." For a long moment, there was silence. Burkhart's eyes flickered, and Miss Marple could see the internal struggle in his face. Finally, he let out a long sigh, his shoulders slumping as if a weight had been lifted from them. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's true, I was being blackmailed. I thought Willingham was the only one who could help me, but I was wrong. He found out things I never wanted anyone to know, and I knew, once he had that letter, there was no going back." Miss Marple's gaze never left him. "But why kill him, Mr. Burkhart? Why resort to murder?" Burkhart looked at her, his face pained. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't. But when he said he was going to turn the letter over to the police, I panicked. I thought everything I had worked for would be ruined. I thought I'd lose everything. So I tried to take the letter back. I confronted him, and He trailed off, and Miss Marple could see the shame in his eyes. It was clear that he had made a fatal mistake. But the question remained: what had truly happened in the moments before Willingham's death? Was it a struggle over the letter, or had there been something more? Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression softening. "It seems, Mr. Burkhart, that you've made a grave error. But I believe the truth is far more complicated than you think." Burkhart looked at her, his face a mixture of confusion and regret. "What do you mean?" "Tell me about the letter," Miss Marple said softly, "and everything else will make sense." The final reveal. All the pieces fall into place. Burkhart's confession was a turning point, but Miss Marple knew that there was still more to the story. There was a missing element, something that Burkhart had overlooked in his panicked explanation, and she intended to find it. With each answer, the pieces of the puzzle came closer to completion, but the true motive behind Willingham's death remained just out of reach. The quiet confrontation had begun to peel back the layers of deceit, but it was only when all the pieces finally fell into place that Miss Marple would be able to reveal the true mastermind behind the crime. The final chapter was drawing near, but there was still much left to uncover. The reveal. All the pieces fall into place. The evening had settled over Little Tatterford with its usual quietude, though beneath the surface, the village was no longer the same. The death of Charles Willingham had cast long shadows on the lives of those who knew him, and the truth about his demise was gradually coming into focus. Miss Marple had played her part, quietly observing, patiently collecting details, and now, at last, she felt the pieces of the puzzle were aligned. Reginald Burkhart's confession had provided an essential breakthrough. His admission about being blackmailed, while telling, did not fully explain the circumstances surrounding Willingham's death. Burkhart's panic, his willingness to confront Willingham, was indicative of desperation, but it didn't necessarily point to murder. What happened in those final moments between the solicitor and the ironworks owner? Why had Willingham been clutching that letter in his hand, and why had it been burned so carefully? Miss Marple had a hunch, a nagging suspicion that something had been overlooked. She had learned enough to know that people often told more than they realized, especially when confronted with the right question. Burkhart's guilt was evident, but his involvement, as it appeared, was only part of the story. The true master of this drama had yet to reveal themselves. It was on the evening of the following day, while Miss Marple sat in her cozy drawing room, the fire crackling softly, that the final clue presented itself. Her mind had been racing through the events of the past weeks, going over each conversation, each observation she had made. And then it clicked. She knew who had truly orchestrated the events leading to Willingham's death. A hidden relationship. The key to the mystery. Miss Marple's suspicions had grown stronger over the past few days. She had been thinking more and more about the dynamics between the key players, Willingham, Miss Stokes, and Burkhart, and had come to realize that there was an overlooked detail in Miss Stokes's confession. The schoolteacher had claimed that Willingham had been trying to help her with the blackmail, but something in her words hadn't quite rung true. Miss Stokes's nervousness had been palpable, and her revelation about the blackmail had seemed a little too convenient. Why had she only confessed so much, leaving out critical details? There was a gap in her story, and Miss Marple was certain that it wasn't simply a matter of fear. The truth was more complex. After all, Miss Stokes had been hiding something from the start, something more than just the affair or the blackmail. And when Miss Marple thought back to the very beginning of the case, to the moment when Willingham had first collapsed, she recalled a peculiar detail that had initially seemed insignificant. It was the way the letter had been burned. The fire had consumed part of it, yes, but there had been no sign of it having been destroyed in haste. No. The edges had been charred carefully, methodically, just enough to obscure the contents, but not enough to completely destroy them. And then Miss Marple remembered something else. Willingham had been holding that letter when he fell, which meant he must have known what was at stake. He had been keeping it from someone he had been trying to protect. Miss Stokes. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her decision made. She had seen enough. It was time to confront Miss Stokes again. This time, she would not let her withhold anything. A quiet confrontation. The truth unfolds. It was an early evening when Miss Marple made her way to the schoolhouse again. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the quiet street. The school was empty, save for Miss Stokes, who was sitting at her desk, her head bowed over a stack of papers. When she looked up and saw Miss Marple standing in the doorway, she froze. There was something different in her expression, an unease that hadn't been there before. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "What brings you back here?" I need to ask you something, Miss Stokes, Miss Marple replied, stepping into the room with the same calm, unhurried pace she always used. Something that I believe you've been keeping from me. Miss Stokes's face paled, and her hand twitched slightly. She stopped herself, swallowing hard. What do you mean? Miss Marple sat down across from her, folding her hands neatly in her lap. I think you know exactly what I mean, Miss Stokes. The blackmail, yes. The letter, yes. But there's more, isn't there? The schoolteacher's eyes darted to the window, her shoulders stiffening. I don't know what you're talking about. Miss Marple smiled gently, but there was a firmness in her eyes. You're lying, Miss Stokes. You've been lying from the very start. The letter that Mr. Willingham had, the one that was burned, wasn't from a blackmailer at all. It was from you, wasn't it? Miss Stokes's face contorted with a mixture of fear and shame. She shook her head, her lips trembling. No, I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted any of this. Please, Miss Marple, I didn't. Miss Marple's voice softened. Tell me the truth, Miss Stokes. That letter wasn't about blackmail. It was a letter of guilt, wasn't it? A letter confessing to something Mr. Willingham had found out. He had uncovered your secret, something far worse than blackmail, and he was going to expose it. The schoolteacher trembled, her hand clutching the edge of her desk. I never wanted anyone to find out. I couldn't let him ruin everything. My whole life would have fallen apart if anyone knew. I never meant for him to. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice low but insistent. You didn't mean for him to die, did you? But you did everything in your power to make sure that letter never saw the light of day. You tried to burn it. But it wasn't enough, was it? Miss Stokes's eyes filled with tears. I didn't kill him. I swear I didn't. But I was afraid. When he said he was going to show the letter to the police, I panicked. I couldn't let him. I couldn't bear it. And so you did what? Miss Marple asked softly, though her gaze never wavered. I tried to stop him. I went to see him. He said he'd give me a chance to explain. But when I arrived, Burkhart was already there. I didn't know what to do. Burkhart saw the letter, and when Willingham wouldn't back down, I don't know what happened. It was a blur. I was just so scared. But I didn't mean for it to go that far. I didn't. Miss Marple studied her carefully, and for a long moment, there was silence. The weight of the truth hung heavily in the air between them. You didn't mean to kill him, Miss Marple said quietly, but you certainly meant to stop him from exposing you. Miss Stokes nodded, the tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I couldn't let it all fall apart. Miss Marple sighed softly. You should have trusted someone. The truth always comes out in the end, Miss Stokes. It's only a matter of time. Aftermath. The village recovers. In the days that followed, Miss Stokes was taken into custody. The villagers were stunned by the revelation, unable to fully grasp the depth of the betrayal that had occurred within their midst. While many of them had suspected that Willingham's death was tied to some personal scandal, few could have guessed the true extent of the tragedy. Little Tatterford, for all its charm and quiet beauty, was never quite the same again. But for Miss Marple, the case had ended as she had known it would, with the truth laid bare. And as she sat by her window, sipping tea and watching the sun set over the village, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. Sometimes it wasn't the grand gestures of a crime that mattered most. It was the smallest details, the quiet moments, and the human frailties that made the greatest difference in the end. And Miss Marple knew, with quiet satisfaction, that she had uncovered them all. The days that followed Miss Stokes's confession passed in a blur for little Tatterford. The revelation of her involvement in Charles Willingham's death had shaken the village to its very core. For a place that prided itself on its quiet and close-knit nature, the truth behind Willingham's death had revealed the dark undercurrents that always existed beneath the surface. No one was untouched, and no one could pretend that they hadn't seen, in some way, how the village had allowed secrets to grow unchecked. Miss Stokes was taken away by the authorities, though there was no celebration in the village. There was only a quiet sense of relief, as if the tension that had hung in the air for weeks had finally released. But that relief was tempered by the realization that the village had lost something irreplaceable: trust in each other, in the fabric that held them all together. The community, though still intact, had been irrevocably altered. Unexpected reactions. The villagers speak. Though many villagers were content to go back to their lives, a select few found themselves more reflective than they had been before. Mrs. Featherstone, as always, was among the first to gossip about the latest developments. "I never trusted her," Mrs. Featherstone said as she sat in her garden, hands on her hips, watching the garden grow under the fading light. "Miss Stokes was always a little too perfect, don't you think? Always so sweet, so kind. But there was something about her I never liked, and I told everyone she'd end up being the one to do something wrong." "But what about the blackmail?" Mrs. Barrington asked, raising an eyebrow as she watered her flowers. "Don't you think it was a bit much to pin everything on her like that?" Mrs. Featherstone waved her hand dismissively. "Well, we all have our dark secrets, don't we? The difference is some of us don't let them ruin everything." She snorted and added, "Still, I suppose we can't blame her entirely. It was Willingham's death that drove her to do it." "But it wasn't just her, was it?" Mrs. Barrington responded thoughtfully. "If Burkhardt hadn't been involved, if he hadn't known about the letter, that's where—" "You're wrong," Mrs. Featherstone interrupted. "Burkhardt was only part of it, but it was Miss Stokes who did the real damage. She was the one who kept the secret from everyone. She's the one who really betrayed us all." Miss Marple, overhearing this conversation from the corner of the street, couldn't help but smile faintly. It was typical of the village to cast blame on those who had become easy targets, forgetting that life was rarely so simple. There were always layers beneath the surface. The real question was whether the village would ever truly recover from what had happened. A quiet reflection. Miss Marple contemplates. Later that evening, as the last vestiges of light faded from the sky and the village settled into the hush of dusk, Miss Marple sat by her fire, reflecting on the events that had transpired. The case had been unusual for her. The twists had been more intricate than she had anticipated, but in the end it had been the human element that had unraveled everything. She thought about Miss Stokes's confession, the way the schoolteacher had finally cracked under pressure. Miss Stokes had tried to bury her past, to live a life of propriety and respectability, but the truth had been too heavy a burden for her to carry alone. It was clear to Miss Marple now that, from the beginning, the woman had been desperate to keep her secrets hidden, even at the cost of her own freedom. But it was also clear that Miss Stokes was not the true architect of Willingham's death. Burkhardt had played a much larger role, though his involvement was born from a more primal fear of exposure rather than malice. Miss Marple smiled softly to herself, knowing full well that people often made decisions based on fear or desperation. It was a trait as old as humanity itself. Yet, even as she marveled at the complexity of human nature, she also felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The case had been solved, the secrets had been laid bare, and the village, though forever changed, would heal in time. The last piece. The letter's truth. As Miss Marple sat by her fire, her thoughts drifted back to the letter. It had been the key to everything. Willingham's death had not been a mere accident. It had been a consequence of the choices made by those who feared what the letter would reveal. But even though the letter had been burned, its contents had left behind a trace, one that had guided Miss Marple's investigation. The letter, despite its burnt edges, had been the crux of the mystery. Willingham had been holding it in his hand when he collapsed, which meant he had either just read it or was in the process of reading it when something had interrupted him. His attempt to conceal it, to destroy it, had been a deliberate act. But why? What had been so damning within that letter that caused such panic? Miss Marple had her theories, but she knew that the real story was known only to Willingham, Miss Stokes, and Burkhardt. And yet, even now, there was a part of Miss Marple that wondered whether the letter had contained more than just the truth of the blackmail. What if there had been something in the letter that went beyond personal guilt, beyond the affair? Could it have been a confession of something more profound, something that would have caused the entire village to turn its back on the man they had once trusted? She would never know. The letter was gone, destroyed beyond repair. But that was often the way of things. People made choices, they made mistakes, and the consequences were not always easy to predict. As Miss Marple sat there, her thoughts swirling, a soft knock on her door broke the silence. It was Inspector Brooks, his face more solemn than usual. "Miss Marple," he said as he entered, "I just wanted to thank you for your help in solving this case. I'm not sure we would have gotten there without you." Miss Marple smiled politely, but gave no hint of pride. "It was simply a matter of observing the right details, Inspector. As you know, the truth is often hidden in plain sight." "I know," he said with a nod. "You have a remarkable way of seeing what others miss." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "There's one thing I don't understand. Why did Burkhardt confess so quickly? Why not deny everything?" Miss Marple regarded him with a steady gaze. "He didn't confess because he was guilty, Inspector. He confessed because he was afraid. Fear is a powerful motivator. It's often the thing that drives people to reveal what they would otherwise keep hidden." Brooks frowned, clearly lost in thought. "So, you believe he was more afraid of Miss Stokes than of anything else?" "I believe Burkhardt was afraid of the truth," Miss Marple replied softly. "And that is often more terrifying than anything else." She leaned back in her chair, her voice becoming almost philosophical. People are afraid of what others might think. They're afraid of losing control, of being judged. And when the truth comes out, as it always does, they can't handle it. Inspector Brooks considered her words for a moment, then nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose we all have our secrets." "We do," Miss Marple said quietly, "and it is those secrets that can destroy us, if we're not careful." As the inspector left her home, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, watching the flickering flames in the hearth. The village would return to its quiet, routine existence. People would move on. But for Miss Marple, the case would remain a quiet reminder of the delicate balance between truth and deception, between secrets kept and secrets revealed. The mystery was over. The village had been given its answers, and Miss Marple could once again return to her peaceful life, content in the knowledge that the truth had been uncovered, even if the full story would never be known. The last few days had passed quietly, in Little Tatterford, and though the villagers were eager to return to their routine, there was a lingering unease that refused to fade. The investigation into Charles Willingham's death had revealed more than anyone had expected, but still, something about the case didn't sit right with Miss Marple. Despite the resolution that had seemingly been reached, she knew that there were still loose threads that, if left untied, would leave this case incomplete. The village had already begun to move on. People had accepted Miss Stokes's confession, though not without a certain degree of shock and sympathy. Many of the villagers still couldn't quite reconcile the gentle schoolteacher they had known with the woman who had been capable of such a desperate act. Still, life continued, as it always did in small towns, with the ebb and flow of ordinary days masking the more extraordinary events that had recently unfolded. Miss Marple, however, was not one to let things settle without ensuring that every detail was in its proper place. The final confrontation with Miss Stokes had been revealing, and Burkhardt's role in the matter had been clarified. Yet something about the sequence of events continued to niggle at Miss Marple's mind. She had seen patterns before, patterns that others missed, patterns that indicated there was more to the story than met the eye. It wasn't the murder itself that troubled her. It was the motive. Yes, Miss Stokes had been the one to act in fear and panic, but there had been something more at play, something that hadn't fully come to light. Miss Marple had a growing suspicion that there had been someone else involved, someone whose role had not been as clear-cut as it seemed. A visitor in the night. Burkhardt's final move. That evening, as the village fell under the velvet cloak of night, Miss Marple sat alone in her drawing room, the fire crackling softly. The wind outside howled, sending whispers of winter through the cracks in the walls. Her thoughts were sharp and focused, still preoccupied with the case that had consumed her over the past few weeks. Just as she was about to retire for the evening, a knock at the door interrupted her quiet thoughts. It was late, and few would be visiting at this hour, especially after all the activity in the village over the past week. Miss Marple stood up. Slowly, curiosity piqued. She opened the door to find none other than Reginald Burkhart, his usual confident demeanor replaced by an expression of unease. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Mr. Burkhart," Miss Marple said, stepping aside to let him in. "What brings you here at this hour?" Burkhart hesitated before answering, his eyes darting nervously. "I need to speak with you. I've been thinking about what happened with Willingham, with everything that's come to light, and I've realized something that I should have told you earlier." Miss Marple gestured for him to sit, her eyes scanning his face. She had suspected that Burkhart wasn't yet finished with the matter, but she hadn't expected him to come to her directly. She sat down across from him, her expression calm and patient. "Go on," she said, her tone inviting but steady. Burkhart cleared his throat, his hands clasped together tightly in his lap. "I didn't tell you everything, Miss Marple. About the letter, about Willingham's plans. There was more to it than what I said before." Miss Marple's curiosity deepened, and she leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" He swallowed hard, looking down at the floor as if gathering the courage to speak. "When I found out Willingham had that letter, I was afraid of what it could do to me. But what I didn't realize at the time was that it wasn't just me he was after. There was someone else, someone who had been pulling the strings the whole time, and that person was my wife." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly, though she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "Margaret Burkhart said, his voice barely above a whisper. She knew about the letter. She knew what it contained. She'd known for months. And when I found out that Willingham had it, I panicked. I thought it was all over. But it wasn't just me who was at risk. It was her, too." "Your wife?" Miss Marple asked, her voice thoughtful. "What did Willingham have on her?" Burkhart's face was a mask of guilt. She had been involved in something with Willingham, a financial deal, a scandal, something that would ruin her. And when he found out, she was afraid he would expose everything. She begged me to get the letter back, but when I couldn't, she took matters into her own hands. Miss Marple sat back, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. It was starting to make sense now. Margaret Burkhart, desperate to keep her own secrets hidden, had been the real motivator behind the events that had led to Willingham's death. She had manipulated her husband, played on his fear, and had ultimately taken the step to silence Willingham once and for all. "Mr. Burkhart," Miss Marple said softly, her voice tinged with sympathy. "You didn't know, did you?" Burkhart's face was a mixture of anger and sorrow. "No, I didn't know. I didn't know how far she'd go. But when I found out, when I realized what she had done, I couldn't turn back. I had to help her. I thought I was protecting her, but in the end, I only made things worse." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind racing through the possibilities. "It seems to me, Mr. Burkhart, that the true culprit was not Miss Stokes at all. She was merely a pawn in a much larger game. Your wife, Margaret, had the most to lose, and she was the one who used her influence over you to ensure that Willingham's secrets were buried forever." Burkhart's eyes darkened as he looked up at her. "I never wanted it to happen, but in the end, it was Margaret who pushed me. She's the one who got rid of the letter. She made sure it was destroyed. I don't know what else she's capable of." The final revelation. Third eye. Unseen hand, Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, processing the new information. Burkhart's role in the death had been clear, but his wife's involvement took the case to an entirely different level. She had manipulated her husband, used him as a shield, and in the end, it was her secret that had led to Willingham's demise. "It's clear now," Miss Marple said softly, her voice laced with a quiet certainty. "Your wife was the one who orchestrated this whole thing. She played on your fears, your loyalty, and used both to cover up her own actions." Burkhart's face crumpled with guilt, and he ran a hand through his hair. "I never wanted any of this. I was just trying to protect her. But now, I see the truth. I never thought she was capable of something like this." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her gaze calm and thoughtful. "The truth is often the hardest thing to accept, Mr. Burkhart. But now you see it clearly." "And so do I." The room was silent for a long while as Burkhart sat there, the weight of his guilt heavy upon him. Miss Marple's words hung in the air, and the final pieces of the mystery had finally clicked into place. Margaret Burkhart had been the unseen hand behind it all. She had been the one to drive her husband to action, to make sure Willingham's secret died with him. But now, the truth had surfaced, and Miss Marple knew that it was only a matter of time before the consequences of that truth would unfold. The village, for all its secrets and intrigue, had come to terms with the resolution of Willingham's death. But for Miss Marple, the case had not been solved until the final, unseen hand had been revealed. The night was deepening as Miss Marple continued to reflect on the revelations that had come to light. The village of Little Tatterford had been shaken to its core. What had once seemed like a straightforward case of a murder linked to personal betrayal and blackmail was unraveling into something far more complex. The truth about the Burkhart family, the desperate lengths they had gone to, and the web of lies spun in the name of protecting dark secrets was slowly revealing itself. Miss Marple had been correct in her assumption that Burkhart's involvement in the case, while significant, was only the beginning. The more she thought about the events leading to Willingham's death, the more she realized that the investigation hadn't ended with the revelation about Margaret Burkhart. There was still something else, something Miss Marple hadn't fully grasped, that lingered just beyond the reach of her understanding. The truth had come close, but there were still shadows that needed to be explored. The wind outside began to pick up, rattling the windows of Miss Marple's cottage as she stared. Into the fire. The flames flickered, casting long shadows across the room. She had been so focused on Burkhart and his wife that she had overlooked another crucial piece of the puzzle: the involvement of Willingham's closest associate, someone who had seemingly disappeared from the scene altogether after the incident. And now, the person who had once been a key part of the investigation was making a quiet reappearance. The knock on the door came unexpectedly, pulling Miss Marple from her musings. She rose from her chair, her movements measured and deliberate, and opened the door. Standing in the doorway with a grim expression was Dr. Hargrove, the village doctor. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he greeted her, his voice thick with something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. There was an air of urgency about him, a tension that had not been there before. "Dr. Hargrove, what brings you here this late?" Miss Marple asked, stepping aside to allow him in. "I need to speak with you," he said, his tone serious. "There's something you need to know, something that I should have told you earlier. It's about Willingham's death. I've been hesitant to speak out, but now I believe it's time." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing that this was no ordinary visit. She motioned for him to sit. "Please, Dr. Hargrove, tell me what's troubling you." He took a seat, clasping his hands together. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, as if weighing his words carefully. "I should start by saying that Willingham wasn't just an ordinary solicitor. He had certain dealings, ones that were kept private even among the closest of friends. He'd been working on something for months, something that involved more than just his legal practice." Miss Marple remained silent, watching him with steady eyes. She had suspected there was more to Willingham's life than met the eye. There always was. "I knew him quite well," Dr. Hargrove continued, his voice growing heavier. "In fact, we were more than just professional acquaintances. Willingham confided in me about a deal he had been brokering with someone from outside the village. At first, I thought it was merely a business matter, but as time went on, I realized it was something more. It involved blackmail, yes, but it also involved something else. Something far more dangerous." Miss Marple sat up straighter. "What do you mean, Dr. Hargrove? What was it that Willingham was involved in?" Dr. Hargrove hesitated before answering, his gaze dropping to the floor. He was working with someone who was involved in much more than petty crimes. This person, this shadowy figure, had leverage over not only Willingham but several key people in the village, people you might know, people who've been hiding things, big things. Miss Marple's mind was already racing, connecting the dots. This new information didn't fit with what she had previously assumed. There had been more at play than just a series of unfortunate personal mistakes. Willingham's death had been the result of a much more calculated effort to silence him, and it wasn't just Miss Stokes and the Burkharts who had been involved. Dr. Hargrove took a deep breath. It was supposed to be a simple business deal, but things got out of hand. Willingham was supposed to hand over a letter that had incriminating information about this person. But the deal went awry. I don't know all the details, but I know that when Willingham didn't deliver, there were consequences. His life was at risk. Miss Marple leaned forward. This person, who were they? And why wasn't this information shared with the constables earlier? Dr. Hargrove shifted uncomfortably. The person in question was Reginald Burkhart. Miss Marple's mind spun at this revelation. But Burkhart confessed to being involved in Willingham's death. Why would he have been working with Willingham then? I don't know all the details, Dr. Hargrove replied, but it seems that Burkhart was just as much a pawn in this game as anyone else. The person who controlled the situation, the one who orchestrated everything from the shadows, was someone else entirely. Who? Miss Marple asked, her voice firm. Dr. Hargrove stood up abruptly, pacing across the room. It was someone close to Burkhart, his business partner. Someone who knew about the financial dealings, the risks involved. Someone who could gain from Willingham's silence. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Are you suggesting that Burkhart's partner was behind all of this? Dr. Hargrove nodded slowly. I believe so. This person had the most to lose if Willingham's letter were made public. And when it seemed that Willingham might turn the tables on them, they did whatever they could to stop him. That's when everything started to fall apart. Miss Marple thought back to Burkhart's confession and the strange, incongruous elements within it. It had never quite made sense that someone so visibly distraught over Willingham's death could have been acting out of pure fear. Fear, yes, but also something else. A deeper involvement, perhaps even without Burkhart's full understanding. But why didn't you speak sooner? Miss Marple asked, a hint of reproach in her voice. I was afraid, Dr. Hargrove admitted, lowering his head. Afraid of the consequences. You see, I'm not the only one who was involved in these dealings. There are others in the village who were, still are, deeply entangled in this mess, and some of them would go to any lengths to keep it hidden. The pieces were falling into place, but Miss Marple knew that Dr. Hargrove, despite his confession, still hadn't revealed everything. There was more to this tangled web of secrets, but for now, she understood the crux of the story. Willingham had not died because of one person's betrayal, but because of a network of fear, greed, and power, with Burkhart merely caught in the middle. A sense of finality. The unfinished case. The following days brought clarity. Inspector Brooks, with Miss Marple's guidance, took Dr. Hargrove's information into consideration. Burkhart's role was re-examined, but the investigation took a different turn as the true mastermind behind the plot, the one who had orchestrated Willingham's death from the shadows, was brought to light. Miss Marple felt a certain satisfaction in knowing that she had uncovered the layers of deception that had clouded the truth. Little Tatterford, though it would take time to recover from the events, could finally begin to heal. The darkest corners of the village had been illuminated, and the last secrets were being pulled from the shadows. But as Miss Marple sat by her fire, watching the flames flicker in the hearth, she knew one thing for certain. Even in the most peaceful of villages, darkness often finds a way to emerge. And the truth, no matter how well hidden, is always waiting to be uncovered. The mystery had reached its end, but Miss Marple knew that there would always be another case waiting, another puzzle to solve. For now, though, the quiet of the village would remain undisturbed, at least until the next secret came to light. The following week unfolded with an air of unease settling over Little Tatterford. Despite the resolution of the case and the eventual revelation of the truth about Willingham's death, the village felt different. The whispers in the streets had faded, but they left an undercurrent of suspicion in their wake. People were no longer as open, no longer as trusting of one another. Miss Stokes's confession and Burkhart's eventual exposure had done little to assuage the discomfort that now lingered in the hearts of the villagers. Miss Marple had done her part. She had unraveled the complex threads of deception, pulling the truth from the tangled web of lies and manipulation. Yet as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to the story. The intricate game of power, fear, and betrayal was not as neatly tied up as it seemed. The shadow of Willingham's death still hung over the village, and something told Miss Marple that the final chapter had yet to be written. It was on an otherwise uneventful afternoon that the first new development occurred. Miss Marple was sitting by the fire in her modest sitting room, tea in hand, when there was a soft knock at her door. She didn't need to look up to know that. It was someone who wasn't expected. The knock was too soft, too tentative, for anyone to be simply dropping by. She placed her teacup down gently, rose from her chair, and went to answer it. Standing on the doorstep was a young man, no older than 25, with dark, anxious eyes. He wore a simple suit, disheveled from travel, and his posture was hunched as though he were carrying some heavy burden. Miss Marple studied him closely as he hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether to speak or simply turn away. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple greeted him softly, her voice warm but not overbearing. "Can I help you?" The young man seemed startled by her calm demeanor, as though expecting a more dramatic reaction. He nodded quickly and took a deep breath. "I'm sorry to bother you, Miss Marple," he said, his voice quivering with uncertainty. "But I need to talk to you. I think you've been involved in the case, the one about Mr. Willingham's death." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Yes, I have been. What can I do for you, Mr. Dawson?" he said, his voice a little stronger now. "Edward Dawson. I was a close associate of Mr. Willingham. I worked with him on a number of legal matters." Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. She had not been aware of any associates who were still lingering in the shadows of Willingham's life. "Please come inside," she said, stepping aside to allow him in. "You mentioned something about Willingham's death. How exactly are you connected to this?" Edward Dawson entered the room hesitantly, looking around as though half expecting someone to appear. Miss Marple led him to the small seating area by the fire, where he sank into the chair opposite her, still fidgeting with his hands. "I don't know where to begin," he said, his voice faltering. "I wasn't part of the public investigations. I wasn't even sure if I should come forward, but I have information. Something important that no one else seems to know. And I think it might change everything you think you know about what happened." Miss Marple remained silent, allowing him to gather his thoughts. She knew better than to rush people in these moments. They always revealed more when given the space to speak. Dawson began again, then paused. He looked at Miss Marple, his eyes filled with both fear and a strange sort of resolve. "I wasn't just Willingham's associate. I was his confidant. I knew about the letter, the one he kept hidden. I knew about the deal with Burkhart and the blackmail. But I didn't know about Miss Stokes. I didn't know any of that." Miss Marple's interest piqued. She sat forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Go on." "I knew Willingham was being blackmailed," Dawson continued, swallowing hard. "But I didn't know the details. I thought it was something small, something minor, the kind of thing he could handle without anyone finding out. But when he spoke to me about the letter, I realized just how serious it was. He said he had something that could destroy certain people in the village. He didn't mention who, but I knew enough to understand that it was a dangerous situation." "And what happened?" Miss Marple asked gently, urging him to continue. I was afraid, Miss Marple. Afraid of what he might do with that letter. I didn't want to be part of something so dangerous. So I suggested that he destroy it. I even offered to help him, to burn it so that no one would ever find it. But he refused. He was determined to keep it safe, even though he knew the risk. Miss Marple's mind raced as she connected the dots. Dawson's confession now added a new layer to the story. It was clear that Willingham had been trying to play both sides, attempting to protect himself while also keeping his own moral compass intact. His refusal to destroy the letter himself made sense now. It wasn't just a piece of evidence that could ruin him. It was a moral decision to keep the truth buried. But why had he been so insistent on preserving the letter? I didn't know what to do after that, Dawson continued, his voice trembling. And then, after Willingham died, I realized something even worse. Someone had taken the letter. I didn't want to believe it at first, but after talking to some people in the village, I realized it had been taken long before Willingham's death. I didn't want to get involved, but now I have no choice. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Someone took the letter before Willingham's death? Dawson nodded slowly, his eyes wide with fear. Yes, I think it was Burkhart's wife, Margaret. She knew everything. She knew about Willingham's dealings, the letter, and how it could ruin her. I think she's the one who orchestrated the whole thing. Miss Marple sat back, her thoughts churning. Margaret Burkhart had been the missing link, the unseen, hand manipulating everything from the shadows. It was no longer a question of who had killed Willingham. It was a question of why he had been kept in the dark for so long. A shadow in the village. Burkhart's wife. The pieces were coming together now, clearer than ever before. Margaret Burkhart, the quiet, unassuming woman who had remained largely in the background throughout the investigation, had orchestrated the entire sequence of events. She had known about Willingham's letter, and she had made sure it would never see the light of day. But why had she acted alone? Dawson, still trembling, seemed to realize the full weight of what he had just said. He looked at Miss Marple, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and relief. I should have done something sooner, but I was afraid. I didn't want to get caught up in it. But I know now. I have to tell the truth. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind already turning over the possibilities. You've done the right thing by coming forward, Mr. Dawson. Now we must figure out how to deal with the rest of this and how to protect those who are still in danger. Dawson's shoulders slumped. What do you mean? Who else is in danger? Miss Marple stood up, her expression calm but resolute. The truth has a way of revealing itself, Mr. Dawson. And while the letter may be destroyed, the consequences of what's been done still linger in the shadows. We must make sure that no more secrets remain hidden and that the true culprit is brought to justice. As Dawson watched Miss Marple, the weight of the situation finally seemed to sink in. He had done the right thing, but Miss Marple knew that the real work was only just beginning. The village of Little Tatterford might never be the same again, but the truth at least would finally come to light. The mystery was far from over, but with each revelation, Miss Marple was one step closer to uncovering the final, devastating truth. The next few days in Little Tatterford were filled with a quiet tension, the kind that hangs heavily in the air when the village knows a storm is coming, even if it hasn't yet broken. The more Miss Marple thought about Edward Dawson's revelation, the confession that had come to her in the middle of the night, the more she realized just how deep the web of deception had truly gone. It wasn't just the Burkharts or Miss Stokes who had been involved in Willingham's death. There were far-reaching consequences, far more players in the game than anyone had anticipated. But who would be the last to be caught in the net? Miss Marple had always trusted her instincts, and in this case, those instincts were telling her that she wasn't done yet. There was one more person, one more figure lurking in the shadows, who needed to be exposed before this case could truly be closed. Edward Dawson, though an ally in the unraveling of this mystery, had inadvertently left a crucial clue behind in his confession. He had been too focused on Margaret Burkhart, on the aftermath of Willingham's death, to realize the implications of his own actions. As Miss Marple sat by her fire that evening, the crackling of the logs filling the otherwise silent room, her mind worked through the labyrinth of motives and secrets that had led to Willingham's death. She turned the details over and over in her mind, considering what Dawson had said and what he had failed to say. The truth about Margaret Burkhart's involvement had been revealed, but the question remained. Why had she acted the way she did? Why had she gone to such lengths to hide the truth? Her fear of exposure was evident, but Miss Marple now suspected that there was more at play, something even darker than a simple desire for self-preservation. There was someone else, someone who had orchestrated everything from behind the scenes. Someone who had used Margaret Burkhart and Edward Dawson as pawns in a game that neither of them fully understood. Miss Marple rose from her chair, a quiet resolve in her step. It was time to confront the final piece of the puzzle. She had to meet with the last person who held the key to this entire mystery. Reginald Burkhart. The The final meeting. Burkhart's truth. The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to the Burkhart estate. It was a grand house, imposing in its size and stature, but Miss Marple had always found it to be slightly cold, devoid of the warmth one might expect in a family home. The house stood like a monument to power and wealth, its walls holding secrets that had been carefully protected for years. Reginald Burkhart was a man of few words, but Miss Marple knew that, in his silence, there was much to uncover. She had learned all she needed to know about his role in the case, his involvement in the affair with Miss Stokes, his fear of the blackmail letter, and his ultimate confession. But there was something more, something missing from his story. When Miss Marple arrived at the front door, she was greeted by a servant who led her to Burkhart's study. The room was large, with heavy mahogany furniture, shelves lined with books, and large windows that let in the morning light. Burkhart sat behind a massive desk, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression one of quiet resignation. "Miss Marple?" he said with a nod, gesturing for her to sit. "I understand you've learned more than I initially revealed. I suppose I should have expected that." "You've always been a man of restraint, Mr. Burkhart," Miss Marple replied with a faint smile, taking the seat opposite him. "But you've also been a man of omission. You've left out important details, and I think it's time we address them." Burkhart's face tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Marple could see the weariness in his eyes. The burden of guilt had clearly taken its toll on him. "You knew, didn't you?" Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but probing. "You knew what was truly at stake. You knew that your wife, Margaret, was involved in something far worse than you realized. And yet, you chose to protect her, blindly, without question." Burkhart looked down at his hands, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. "I did what I thought was right," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Margaret, she's my wife. I couldn't let her face the consequences of her actions. I couldn't let her ruin everything we've worked for." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes locked onto his. "But you weren't just protecting her, were you? You were protecting yourself as well. You knew that if the truth about her came to light, it would destroy both of you. But it wasn't just the letter that mattered. It was the power and influence you had in the village. The connections you were trying to preserve. You were afraid of losing everything." Burkhart's eyes flickered with something darker. Regret, perhaps, or anger. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "I didn't want any of this to happen. But Margaret, she made me see things in a different way. She made me realize that sometimes you have to do whatever it takes to protect what's yours." Miss Marple's expression softened, but only slightly. "That's the trouble, Mr. Burkhart. You thought you were protecting something that was already lost. You thought you could control the narrative, keep the secrets, keep everything hidden. But in doing so, you ensured that the truth would come out in the end." Burkhart's face hardened, and he looked away from her, his gaze falling to the floor. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," he said, almost as though speaking to himself. "But I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop her." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her mind piecing together the final elements of the story. Burkhart had been used, manipulated, just as much as anyone else in this tangled mess. But the true architect of this tragedy was Margaret, whose fear and desperation had driven her to orchestrate Willingham's death. "Mr. Burkhart," Miss Marple said gently, "you may have been a pawn in this game, but you still played your part. You helped cover up a crime that cost someone their life." Burkhart's face flushed with a mix of shame and anger. "What do you want from me, Miss Marple? What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry? That I wish I could turn back time? I can't. I've made my choices, and now I'll have to live with them." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but there was no trace of pity in her expression. "You'll have to face the consequences, Mr. Burkhart, just as your wife will. But perhaps in time you'll come to understand that your choices were made from fear, not from strength. And fear, Mr. Burkhart, is never a good foundation for any decision." The final conclusion. The healing begins. As Miss Marple, left the Burkhart estate, she felt the weight of the case slowly lifting from her shoulders. The final confession had been made, and the pieces of the mystery were finally aligned. The story of Willingham's death had come full circle, and the truth had been revealed in all its ugly complexity. The lives of those involved, Burkhart, his wife Margaret, Edward Dawson, Miss Stokes, had been irrevocably altered, and there was no going back. But Miss Marple knew that the village would eventually heal. The secrets had been exposed, the guilty parties had been held accountable, and little Tatterford could now begin to move forward. As she walked through the village, she could sense the changes in the air, an uneasy peace, but peace nonetheless. The village would recover, and, though the scars of the past would remain, they would serve as a reminder of the importance of truth and the consequences of hiding it. And for Miss Marple, the case was now closed. Another mystery solved, another chapter in her life written, and another lesson learned about the darkness that can reside even in the most innocent of places. For now, at least, little Tatterford could rest until the next secret came to light. Weeks passed since the resolution of Charles Willingham's death, and little Tatterford had begun to resume its quiet, unremarkable pace. The village, which had once thrived on secrets, was now left in the aftermath of a tangled web of deceit, blackmail, and murder. The key players, Reginald and Margaret Burkhart, Miss Stokes, and Edward Dawson, had all faced the consequences of their actions, and the village had slowly started to heal from the shock. But Miss Marple, as ever, knew that things were never truly finished. There were always remnants of the past left behind, small details that could shift the whole narrative once again. The days were growing colder, and with the changing season came a certain stillness in the air. Miss Marple had always felt that a change in the weather was a sign of a shift in the tide, a precursor to something hidden beneath the surface that was waiting to be uncovered. It wasn't a dread she felt. No, it was more of a quiet anticipation. She had solved the mystery, yes, but she could sense that there was still a lingering shadow that needed to be addressed. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Miss Marple had been sitting at her writing desk, finishing up a letter to an old friend, when a sudden knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She set down her pen and rose from her seat, her heart quickening slightly. The knock was firm, insistent, yet strangely composed, as if whoever stood on the other side was in no hurry to leave. She opened the door to find a familiar face. Inspector Brooks, his usual authoritative air replaced by something more reserved, almost apologetic. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow in silent inquiry, and the inspector seemed to take a moment before speaking. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he began, his voice measured. "I'm afraid there's something I need to discuss with you. Something I should have addressed sooner. May I come in?" "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside to let him enter. "You don't need to explain. Please sit down." Brooks removed his hat and settled into the armchair across from Miss Marple, his eyes scanning the room for a moment before he spoke again, this time with a certain gravity in his voice. "I've been reviewing the case, going over everything, one last time, and something has come to my attention that I didn't want to share with anyone, not until I was sure." Miss Marple remained silent, her expression calm but attentive, waiting for him to continue. "It's about Margaret Burkhart," Brooks said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I thought we knew everything there was to know about her involvement in Willingham's death, but I was wrong." Miss Marple's eyebrows furrowed slightly. "What do you mean, Inspector?" "I've been going through some old files trying to tie up any loose ends," Brooks continued, "and there was one detail that didn't sit right with me, the way Margaret's alibi was constructed. At first, everything checked out. She was with her family at the time of Willingham's collapse. But after going back through the statements, I found something that doesn't add up." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "What didn't add up?" "The time," Brooks replied, his face troubled. "Margaret claimed she was with her family during the entire evening of Willingham's death. But when I checked the logs again, I found that the time they said they were together didn't align with the actual timeline of Willingham's collapse." Miss Marple's heart quickened. This was unexpected. She had believed that the case had been closed, and yet, here was a thread that had gone unnoticed. "Do you mean to say that Margaret was not where she claimed to be?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but with a sharp edge of curiosity. Brooks nodded. Exactly. It seems she was unaccounted for during a short window of time. That window, Miss Marple, happens to be exactly when Willingham was murdered. Miss Marple sat back, processing this new information. So, you're suggesting that Margaret may have been involved after all? I'm afraid I'm not sure, Brooks said, his frustration evident. But I believe there's more to it than we've been told. I've been doing some digging, and I found something else that complicates matters further. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but it's becoming clear that there were things Margaret kept hidden. Things that went beyond what we initially thought. The unseen evidence. The second layer of deception. Brooks stood up, pacing the room as he continued his narrative. I found a letter. It was tucked away in a drawer, hidden beneath some old files that no one had bothered to look at. It wasn't the letter that was initially associated with the case, the one Willingham had been holding, but it was written by Margaret herself. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. A letter from Margaret? What did it say? Brooks paused, looking down at the floor as if considering how to explain the weight of what he had discovered. The letter was addressed to Willingham. It was a desperate plea asking him to keep a secret that had been weighing on her for years. It mentioned something about a past she wanted to keep buried. It wasn't just about the blackmail. It was about something far more personal. Miss Marple leaned forward, intrigued. And this letter? It was never found? No, Brooks replied, shaking his head. It was destroyed, but not by Willingham. He had hidden it in his office, intending to confront Margaret about it later. From the evidence, it looks like Margaret knew he had it, and she took action to prevent it from being exposed. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, deep in thought. The implications were significant. This letter, this missing piece of the puzzle, could change everything. Margaret Burkhart, once merely a secondary player in this story, was now at the center of it all. But what had she been hiding? What was so terrible that she had gone to such extreme lengths to keep it hidden? Inspector, Miss Marple said finally, her voice measured, I believe the truth is more complicated than we've been led to believe. Margaret didn't just want to hide the letter. She wanted to protect something far darker. And I think we've only scratched the surface. Brooks looked at her, his eyes wide with understanding. You think there's more? I'm certain of it, Miss Marple replied softly. This letter was the key to everything, and now we must find it. The search for the letter. The final chase. That evening, as the village settled into the quiet of night, Miss Marple and Inspector Brooks made their way to the Burkhart estate once again. This time, however, their purpose was different. They weren't just seeking answers from Margaret. They were searching for the letter, an object that could hold the key to unraveling the final layer of this tangled mystery. I don't think Margaret ever intended to leave that letter behind, Miss Marple mused quietly, as they approached the estate's back entrance, which had been left slightly ajar. She probably hid it somewhere only she would know. Brooks nodded. It's clear she wanted to protect her own secret. And if we're right, then this letter could expose everything. Her involvement in Willingham's death, the blackmail, and whatever else she was trying to cover up. They crept into the house, careful not to disturb anything, their footsteps muffled on the thick carpets. Miss Marple led the way, her sharp eyes scanning every surface for a clue. They searched the study first, rifling through drawers and shelves, hoping to find the letter Margaret had so desperately tried to conceal. It wasn't long before Brooks let out a quiet exclamation. I found it, he whispered, holding up a small envelope, yellowed with age. Miss Marple approached, her heart pounding in her chest. The letter, at last. She took it from him, carefully opening it with hands that didn't tremble, though her mind raced with anticipation. As she read the words written on the page, a sense of clarity washed over her. Margaret Burkhart's past was laid bare within these words. But now, the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and Miss Marple knew the last secret hidden in Little Tatterford was ready to be revealed. The case was nearing its end, but Miss Marple understood that the most dangerous secrets were always the ones kept the longest. The letter, small and inconspicuous in appearance, was the key to unraveling the final layers of the mystery. Miss Marple held it in her hands, feeling the weight of it as though it were a heavy stone, each word written on its surface a grain of truth that had been hidden for far too long. The crinkled paper and faded ink told a story of desperation, deceit, and fear, emotions that had driven Margaret Burkhart to the extremes she had taken to protect herself and her family. As Miss Marple carefully unfolded the letter, her eyes scanned its contents, absorbing each line with an intense focus. The writing was neat, yet the words conveyed a sense of urgency, a desire to keep hidden something so dark, so deeply buried, that Margaret Burkhart had gone to great lengths to ensure it remained forgotten. "It's all here, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, handing the letter to Brooks, who was standing beside her. He took the letter carefully, reading its contents with a mixture of disbelief and growing understanding. The contents of the letter: a long-buried secret. The letter, dated several years prior, was a confession of sorts, written by Margaret to Charles Willingham. It revealed that she had been involved in a highly illegal financial scheme, one that had begun innocently enough but had spiraled out of control. Willingham had discovered the scheme during one of their many consultations about the family's finances, and when Margaret had realized he was planning to expose the details, she had taken drastic action to prevent it. Her involvement, it seemed, had been more than just a financial error. It was the thread that connected her to a much larger and more dangerous web of corruption. The letter described how she had been coerced into signing several fraudulent documents, and how, over time, she had become entangled in a series of criminal activities that had nothing to do with her husband's business. She had been trying to protect not just herself, but Reginald as well, from the consequences of her actions. And now she feared the worst. Willingham had become a threat to everything she had worked so hard to build. Margaret's plea was simple, yet chilling. She asked Willingham to keep her secret, promising to sever all ties with the criminals involved and to make things right. But it was clear from the tone of the letter that she was terrified of what would happen if her involvement were exposed. And so, as the days passed, she had made plans to silence Willingham, to ensure that the secrets he had uncovered would never see the light of day. The letter ended with a desperate plea for forgiveness, a promise to make amends, and a clear admission of guilt. Margaret had been afraid, trapped in a situation that had grown beyond her control. She knew she couldn't turn back, but she also knew that Willingham's refusal to destroy the letter had sealed her fate. She would do anything to protect herself and her family, even if it meant resorting to violence. The shocking discovery: a web of lies. Miss Marple watched carefully as Brooks read through the letter, his brow furrowed in disbelief. It was clear that the contents of the letter were far more than anyone had anticipated. The connection between Margaret's actions and Willingham's death was undeniable. But there was more to it than just fear and self-preservation. There was the unspoken truth of how far Margaret was willing to go to protect her family and her social standing. "Inspector, do you see now?" Miss Marple asked, her voice quiet but resolute. The motive was not simply self-preservation. Margaret was afraid of what would happen if Willingham exposed her, but she also believed in her desperation that by removing Willingham from the equation, she could stop everything from falling apart. Brooks nodded slowly, as though piecing together the implications of the letter. But why did she involve Burkhart? And why not simply confront Willingham herself if it was all about the letter? "That's the key," Miss Marple replied, her tone sharp. "Margaret wasn't acting alone, Inspector. She couldn't have. Her involvement in the scheme was far too deep, and she knew that Willingham's moral compass was strong enough to bring down everything she had worked for. But there was someone else, someone who stood to lose even more than she did." Brooks's eyes widened as the pieces clicked into place. Burkhart. He didn't just act out of fear. He was protecting his wife, wasn't he? "Yes," Miss Marple said, her eyes gleaming with a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Reginald Burkhart's role was more complicated than we first thought. He wasn't just manipulated into helping his wife. He was equally complicit. And he had been, for a long time. But it wasn't until he realized that the stakes were much higher than he had imagined, that Willingham wasn't just a solicitor, but a threat to everything they had built, that he decided to act. The final connection. Margaret's. Desperate move. Miss Marple paused, collecting her thoughts before continuing. Margaret's decision to go behind Burkhart's back and take matters into her own hands was a desperate one. She believed that by eliminating Willingham, she could remove the threat not only to herself, but to her family's name, and to the very foundation of the life they had built in this village. But it was that very action, that choice, that sealed her fate. It was a mistake, one that led to a chain of events neither she nor Burkhart could control. Brooks looked at Miss Marple, his face a mixture of respect and astonishment. "You've known all along, haven't you, that Margaret was behind it all? But I still don't understand. Why did she go so far to cover it up? Why not just confess?" "Because, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "some secrets are more dangerous than the truth. Margaret had woven a life around her deception, built an empire on lies and half-truths. To confess would have meant losing everything. And in her mind, losing everything was far worse than the consequences of murder. The final act, confronting the past." As the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place, Miss Marple knew that the story was far from over. Margaret Burkhart, though facing the consequences of her actions, was not the only one to blame. Her choices had led to Willingham's death, but the true tragedy lay in the fact that she had tried to protect not just herself but her family, at all costs. It was a reminder of how easily fear could drive people to do terrible things. Later that afternoon, Inspector Brooks arranged for Margaret Burkhart to be confronted with the full truth. She had been brought to the station, where Miss Marple was present, her calm presence almost a contrast to the storm of emotions swirling around the room. Margaret stood before them, her face pale, her eyes still filled with the same mixture of guilt and fear that had characterized her actions throughout the investigation. She knew what was coming. There was no escaping the consequences now. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I never wanted it to come to this. I just wanted to protect us. I thought I could bury everything, keep it hidden forever." Miss Marple looked at her with a sad understanding. "You thought that your secrets could remain hidden forever, Margaret. But secrets, no matter how deep they're buried, always find a way to surface." Brooks stepped forward, his face grim but resolute. "Margaret Burkhart, you are under arrest for the murder of Charles Willingham." The aftermath. The weight of truth. In the weeks that followed, little Tatterford began to heal, though the scars of the past remained. The Burkharts faced the full weight of their crimes, and the village, once cloaked in secrecy, started to return to its quieter, more tranquil existence. But there was no denying the fact that things had changed. The village had faced its darkest hour, and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger for it. As Miss Marple sat by her fire that evening, reflecting on the events that had unfolded, she allowed herself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. The truth had come to light, and while it had cost some people dearly, it had also brought the village back from the brink of destruction. For Miss Marple, the mystery was now over, but the lessons learned from it would stay with her for a long time. Truth, after all, was a powerful thing, and sometimes the truth was the hardest thing to face. But for little Tatterford, the truth had set them free. And for Miss Marple, it was another mystery solved. The events of the past few weeks had left an indelible mark on the village of Little Tatterford. It wasn't just the revelation of Charles Willingham's death or the unmasking of the Burkharts as the central figures in the crime. It was the ripple effect that followed. How the village, so accustomed to its peaceful rhythms, had been jolted out of its complacency. The quiet life they had once taken for granted had been stripped bare, exposing the fragile seams that held them together. The truth, once uncovered, had given them a chance to rebuild, but at what cost? As autumn settled over the village, its golden light softened by the fading leaves of the trees, Miss Marple found herself observing the quiet recovery of the town, with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She knew that life would never quite be the same. For some, the scars of the past would be too deep to heal, and the whispers of what had transpired would echo through the streets for years to come. But for others, the resolution of the case offered a sense of closure, a return to the normality they craved. It was a bittersweet truth. one that Miss Marple had come to accept after so many years of solving mysteries that left behind more questions than answers. Miss Marple, however, was not one to dwell on the past for too long. Her mind was always moving forward, always observing, always finding the next puzzle to solve. And so, as the village began to find its footing again, Miss Marple turned her attention back to her quiet life, content in the knowledge that the case had been solved and justice had been served. It was on one particularly crisp afternoon that she received an unexpected visitor, none other than Edward Dawson, the young man who had played a pivotal role in unraveling the web of lies and deceit surrounding Willingham's death. Dawson had not been seen in the village since the case had concluded, and Miss Marple had assumed that he had returned to whatever life he had before becoming entangled in the dark affairs of Little Tatterford. Yet here he was standing at her doorstep, looking as anxious and uncertain as he had the first time they had spoken. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Dawson said, his voice hesitant but polite. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Mr. Dawson," Miss Marple replied, offering him a seat. "Please, come in. What brings you here today?" Dawson entered, his eyes scanning the room nervously as he took a seat across from Miss Marple. He had changed since their last encounter. There was a weariness in his demeanor, a subtle shift in his posture that spoke of someone who had borne the weight of too many secrets for too long. "I've come to thank you," he said after a long pause, his eyes meeting hers. "For everything. For helping me understand what really happened, and for showing me that there's more to life than just running away from the truth." Miss Marple watched him closely, sensing that there was more to this conversation than simple gratitude. "I'm glad I could help, Mr. Dawson, but it seems to me that you've come here with something on your mind, something you'd like to share." Dawson hesitated before nodding slowly. "Yes, there is something. I've been thinking a lot about what happened with Margaret and Reginald Burkhart, and about what I did, or rather, what I didn't do. I realize now that I never truly understood the full extent of their actions, or how deeply they were involved in all of this. I was just so focused on helping you solve the case that I didn't stop to think about the aftermath, about the people left behind." Miss Marple nodded gently, her expression one of quiet understanding. "You were trying to make things right, Mr. Dawson. That's all anyone can do when faced with such a tangled situation. But you're right to acknowledge the consequences of what happened. We all play our parts in the stories that unfold around us, whether we realize it or not." Dawson looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve. "I'm not sure I can live with what I've done. I helped expose the Burkharts, yes, but I didn't help them in the end. I didn't try to stop Margaret when I had the chance. I should have done something. I should have known that she was more involved than I ever realized." Miss Marple's voice softened. "The truth is often difficult to face, Mr. Dawson, but sometimes the most important thing is not to dwell on what we didn't do, but to focus on what we can do now. What you've done is already a step in the right direction." Dawson looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I'm trying to move on. But I think what I learned from all of this is that it's never too late to do the right thing. I've decided to leave Little Tatterford to start fresh somewhere else. I don't think I can stay here knowing what I know. I need to find a place where I can put all of this behind me." Miss Marple smiled softly, her eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. "You'll find your way, Mr. Dawson. Sometimes starting over is the best thing we can do for ourselves. And remember, even when we think we've made mistakes, the most important thing is that we learn from them." The coming of winter. The village settles. As the weeks turned into months, Little Tatterford slowly returned to its quiet existence. The scandal surrounding Willingham's death, the Burkharts, and the web of deceit that had ensnared the entire village faded into the background, replaced by the normal ebb and flow of daily life. People began to whisper less, and the constant tension that had plagued the village lifted, though some were still haunted by the memories of what had occurred. Miss Marple, of course, continued her daily routines. Her walks through the village became familiar to the townspeople, her presence a comforting constant in a world that had been shaken by secrets and lies. The village had healed, but it had done so with the understanding that it would never quite be the same again. Trust had been broken, but time, ever the great healer, had begun to repair the fractures that had formed in the fabric of their community. One afternoon, As the first snow began to fall gently over the village, Miss Marple stood by her window, watching the soft flakes drift down in a quiet, peaceful flurry. It was the kind of evening that seemed to lull the world into a sense of calm, the kind that felt like a deep breath after a long period of tension. It was a moment of stillness, a moment of peace after a storm. She turned away from the window, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. There was still much to be done, still many more mysteries to uncover. But for now, she was content. Little Tatterford had returned to its peaceful ways, and with it, so had Miss Marple. She sat back in her favorite chair, her knitting resting on the table beside her. As the fire crackled gently in the hearth, Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to simply be. The mystery had been solved, the final pieces had fallen into place, and for the first time in many weeks, the weight on her shoulders had lightened. For now, little Tatterford was at peace. But Miss Marple knew that, as always, the truth had a way of resurfacing, and when it did, she would be ready, quietly waiting to bring it into the light. The village had healed, and Miss Marple could finally rest until the next mystery, the next twist in the story, came her way. Though Miss Marple had enjoyed the quietude that settled over little Tatterford, she was never one to expect long-lasting peace. The village had a way of settling into its old rhythm only to be disturbed again, often in the most unexpected ways. And it was on a crisp winter afternoon, when the air was sharp and the village square had been dusted with a soft coating of snow, that the calm was broken once more. Miss Marple had just returned from a brisk walk around the village when the knock at her door came. It was a sound that had become almost too familiar in recent months, but this time it carried an unfamiliar urgency. She opened the door to find a tall, thin man standing before her, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He had an air of someone who had been traveling for quite some time, his clothes weathered, his shoes worn. "Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice low but clear. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No disturbance at all," Miss Marple replied, her curiosity piqued. She stepped aside to let the man in. "It's not often I receive visitors this late in the day. Please, come in." The man entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. His features were sharp, an angular face, high cheekbones, and piercing eyes that, though tired, held an intelligent gleam. He looked around the room, taking in the cozy interior, before meeting Miss Marple's gaze once more. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, taking a seat at her invitation. "My name is Thomas Gray. I've come to speak with you about something that has been on my mind for quite some time now." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Please, Mr. Gray, what is it you wish to discuss?" Thomas Gray shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unsure of how to begin. "It's regarding the Willingham case," he began. "I'm afraid it concerns something that was never fully revealed to the public, something important, and I believe it's something only you can help me with." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, the familiar thrill of a mystery beginning to stir within her. "I see. Go on, Mr. Gray." A hidden connection. Unveiling the past. Gray's fingers twitched nervously as he spoke, as though reluctant to reveal the full scope of what he knew. "I was a business associate of Mr. Willingham. We worked together on several legal matters, though not closely enough for most to notice. He was meticulous, professional. But there was something more. Something he didn't tell anyone. Something he didn't even tell me until it was too late." Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression attentive but gentle. "What do you mean by that, Mr. Gray?" "There was a person, someone Willingham had been in contact with for quite some time. They were involved in his work, but their connection was never fully understood by anyone except Willingham." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "And that person might be the key to understanding the true reason behind Willingham's death." Miss Marple remained silent, watching him closely. She had learned long ago that people often hesitated before revealing their secrets, and she had learned just as quickly that patience was the key to unlocking those secrets. "I've heard rumors, Miss Marple. Rumors that Willingham had been in possession of something valuable. Not just a letter, but evidence of a much larger conspiracy. And this person, this shadow in the background, had been trying to get it from him. They were willing to go to any lengths. Miss Marple's mind was already working, connecting the dots. She had known there was more to the case than just Margaret Burkhart's fear of exposure. She had suspected there were forces at play far larger than a simple financial scandal. But now, it seemed, a new figure had entered the scene, a person who might have been responsible for setting the chain of events in motion. "Tell me more about this person," Miss Marple prompted, her voice steady. Gray's eyes flickered, with unease, as though even speaking of this person caused him discomfort. "I don't know their name, Miss Marple. They were never fully revealed to me. Willingham kept their identity secret, but they were powerful. I'm sure of it. They had influence, connections that could ruin anyone." He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. "I'm sorry, I don't know how much help I can be, but when I heard about the case, about everything that had happened, I began to suspect that it wasn't just about Willingham's death. It was about this shadow, this figure who wanted to cover their tracks. Unraveling the truth. Who was the shadow? Miss Marple's mind raced as Gray spoke. A powerful, shadowy figure connected to Willingham's work. Someone who had the means and motive to manipulate the situation from the shadows. This person wasn't just a business associate or an acquaintance. They were the puppet master, pulling the strings that had led to Willingham's tragic death. "You believe this person is the true cause of Willingham's demise?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity. Gray nodded, his face pale. "I think so. And I think they're still out there. They may have been the one who killed him, or at least set everything in motion." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was already turning. She had suspected that the motives behind Willingham's murder were deeper than what had first appeared. She had seen the desperation in the Burkharts' eyes, the fear in Miss Stokes's voice. But now, with this new revelation, the complexity of the situation was beginning to make sense. "I need to find out more about this person, Mr. Gray," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "I believe you are right. The key to this case lies in understanding their role. If we can uncover who they are, we can unravel the rest of this mystery." Gray looked both relieved and apprehensive. "I don't know how much help I can be, but I'm willing to assist however I can. I only wish I had more to offer." Miss Marple stood up, her gaze sharp with determination. "You've given me more than enough, Mr. Gray. Now, it's time for us to finish what we've started. I'll find this shadow, and I'll expose the truth." The search begins. Following the lead. The next day, Miss Marple began her quiet investigation into this new lead, following the subtle clues that had been left behind in the wake of Willingham's death. She had learned long ago that a seemingly insignificant detail could unlock the door to the truth, and she was determined not to let this lead slip through her fingers. Her first step was to revisit the places Willingham had frequented: his office, the places he had been seen with his associates, and any potential connections to figures outside of the village. She started with his business records, poring over the documents he had kept in his office. As she sifted through them, she came across several names that hadn't been mentioned in the initial investigation. These names were not familiar to her, but they had been listed as contacts for Willingham's more sensitive dealings. One name stood out above the rest: R. Alexander Blackwell. Miss Marple's mind clicked into action as she wrote the name down in her notebook. Blackwell was a name she had heard whispered in the corridors of influence, an influential figure in the city who operated behind the scenes. He was a man who wielded power quietly, never making his presence known to the public but always pulling the strings when it came to business and politics. Could it be? Could Blackwell be the shadow that had haunted Willingham's final days? As the sun began to set, Miss Marple made her plans. She would track down R. Alexander Blackwell. The final piece of the puzzle was nearly within her grasp. Little Tatterford had its share of secrets, but she had a feeling that this one, the one connected to Blackwell, was the most dangerous yet. The game was far from over, and Miss Marple knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. The name R. Alexander Blackwell had been floating in Miss Marple's mind, ever since she'd found it among the papers in Willingham's office. Blackwell wasn't a name commonly spoken in Little Tatterford. but it was one that carried weight in circles far beyond the quiet confines of the village. It was the name of someone who operated from the shadows, someone who had connections, influence, and a propensity for making things disappear without a trace. To unravel the final pieces of Willingham's death, Miss Marple knew that she had to learn more about this figure, whose shadow had loomed larger with every passing day. The problem, of course, was that Blackwell didn't seem to have any obvious presence in the village. Willingham, as meticulous as he was, had kept his dealings with Blackwell under wraps, and no one in Little Tatterford seemed to know much about him. It was as though Blackwell was a ghost, his existence hinted at only in the faintest of clues, but never truly solidified. Miss Marple, however, was no stranger to ghosts. She had spent a lifetime uncovering the secrets that people worked so hard to hide, and she knew that every ghost left behind a trace. The question was, where should she begin? The search for Blackwell. Uncovering connections, Miss Marple started with the local records. She revisited Willingham's office the next morning, a quiet determination in her step. The estate had been mostly untouched since the investigation had concluded. It wasn't surprising. Willingham had no immediate family, and his passing had left no personal heirs. His life had been tied to his work, and with his death, much of his world seemed to have vanished, leaving only the residue of his dealings behind. Miss Marple took her time sifting through the stacks of legal files, business contracts, and personal notes, looking for any reference to Blackwell. Her eyes narrowed when she found an old letterhead from a prominent law firm in London. One she recognized immediately. The name on the letterhead read, Blackwell and Gray Legal Advisors. The letter was brief, a formal request for a document, but the mention of Blackwell's full name caught Miss Marple's attention. R. Alexander Blackwell. The letter was signed by a solicitor named Thomas Gray, the same Thomas Gray who had come to Miss Marple just days before, offering his insight into Willingham's dealings. Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she connected the dots. Thomas Gray had been working closely with Willingham, possibly the intermediary who facilitated Willingham's dealings with Blackwell. It wasn't much to go on, but it was enough to suggest that Gray might hold the key to learning more about Blackwell's involvement. He had seemed like a man burdened by guilt when he spoke with her. Perhaps it was time to speak with him again. After a brief visit to the local inn to inquire about Gray's whereabouts, Miss Marple was directed to a small cottage on the outskirts of the village, where Gray had been staying. It was a modest home, with ivy creeping up the walls and a neat, little garden out front. When Miss Marple knocked on the door, she was greeted by the same anxious expression that had characterized their previous encounter. "Miss Marple," Gray said, his voice weary but cordial. "I didn't expect to see you again. Please come in." Miss Marple entered the cottage, her gaze sharp as she took in the surroundings. The space was sparsely furnished, but it was clear that Gray had been living there for some time. He led her to a small sitting area, where they both sat down. Miss Marple wasted no time in getting to the point. "I've come to speak with you about something you mentioned before, Mr. Gray," she began. "Gray," she began. "You said that Willingham had been in contact with someone who was involved in his death, someone who had influence. I found a connection between Willingham and a man named R. Alexander Blackwell. I believe you know him." Gray stiffened, his eyes darting to the window as if to avoid her gaze. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to say anything. I thought it was better to let it all go, to move on. But you're right, Miss Marple. I do know Blackwell. And yes, I worked with him, indirectly on several occasions. But I'm afraid I can't tell you much more than that." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, studying him closely. "Mr. Gray, I believe you know far more than you're letting on. This man, Blackwell, wasn't just a business associate to Willingham. He was much more than that, wasn't he? He controlled things from the shadows, manipulating situations in his favor. And I believe he was the one who orchestrated Willingham's death." Gray looked at her, his expression one of conflict. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, his eyes filled with doubt. I can't give you what you're looking for, Miss Marple. Blackwell is a dangerous man. He has ties that reach far beyond this village. He's not someone you want to get involved with. But you are involved, Mr. Gray. Miss Marple said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "You've already given me enough to connect him to this case. And if you truly wish to put things behind you, you must help me now. This isn't just about Willingham anymore. It's about the truth. And that truth will come out one way or another." Gray's face paled as Miss Marple's words struck home. After a moment of silence, he slumped in his chair, defeated. "You're right. I've known for some time that this wouldn't end well. Blackwell, he's been involved in more than just business. His reach goes into politics, into the higher echelons of power. He's not someone who can be exposed easily. I didn't want to get any deeper into it, but now I see that I've already been a part of it. I'll tell you what I know. The shocking truth. The mastermind. Unveiled." Gray leaned forward, his voice low as he began to explain. "Our Alexander Blackwell isn't just a businessman. He's a fixer, a man who cleans up other people's messes, no questions asked. He has a network of people, lawyers, officials, even criminals, who do his bidding without ever knowing the full extent of his operations." Willingham got caught in his web when he stumbled upon a deal that went south. It involved large sums of money, and Willingham's ethics didn't allow him to turn a blind eye. That's when Blackwell became interested. Miss Marple listened intently, her mind racing as Gray continued. Willingham was going to expose the deal, but Blackwell had too much to lose. He couldn't let that happen. So he made sure that Willingham's death looked like an accident, a stroke, a moment of ill health. But it wasn't. It was planned. It was controlled. "And Margaret Burkhart?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but sharp. "Margaret," Gray said, his face tightening, "was Blackwell's ally, whether she knew it or not. She was used as a pawn in his game. She thought she was protecting herself and Reginald, but she was merely a piece in a much larger puzzle. Blackwell had been pulling the strings from the start." Miss Marple sat back, her heart heavy with the weight of the revelation. So, this wasn't just about the Burkharts. This was about something much larger, something that Willingham had uncovered and Blackwell couldn't afford to have exposed. Gray nodded slowly. "Exactly. And now, with Willingham dead, Blackwell thinks he's won. But the truth will come out. It always does." Miss Marple stood, a quiet determination in her step. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Gray. You've given me what I need." Gray looked up at her, his expression filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "I hope you can stop him, Miss Marple. I hope you can stop him before he does the same thing to someone else." The final act. The chase begins. Miss Marple knew that the final chapter of this mystery was far from over. She had learned much from Gray's confession, and now the task was clear. She had to track down R. Alexander Blackwell, expose him, and ensure that justice was served for Willingham's death. But she also knew that this would not be easy. Blackwell was a man of power, and those who held power were rarely brought down without a fight. The clock was ticking.